A rogue helicopter flying over the Venezuelan Supreme Court with a rebel policeman at the helm throwing grenades down is the latest shocking video to come out of the escalating crisis in Venezuela. With an economy in tatters, President Maduro blames the opposition for seeking a U.S.-backed coup while implementing economic warfare upon the country. Images of violence and even pro-government supporters being set on fire have added to the disturbing images of a crisis becoming increasingly out of control. The standoff grows ever more divisive, with the opposition and government digging in their heels, even as the government seeks to bring to the fore a constituent assembly. That and more in this debate with me, Waqar Rizvi.
Chaos and protests continue in Venezuela as the country is plunging in a political and humanitarian crisis. On Friday, streets of the capital, Caracas, were once again the scene of anti-government demonstrations. More than 60 students were arrested. This was the latest protest in a series of anti-government rallies that rocked the country in the past 3 months. The opposition accuses the government of repression, groundless detentions, and chronic mismanagement. But President Nicolas Maduro believes that the protests are supporting a U.S.-backed coup attempt. The ongoing crisis, that at times turned deadly, tipped toward the surreal this week. On Tuesday, a helicopter attacked the Supreme Court and the Interior Ministry, dropping grenades while firing shots. No one was injured, and Maduro called it a terrorist attack, accusing the U.S. government of being behind the incident. Along with the protests and clashes, the economic situation is getting worse by the day. The inflation rate is a triple-digit number, and people are grappling with food shortages. Children are the worst affected, with many of them suffering from malnutrition, while some of them fall victim to preventable diseases. The country is dependent on oil exports, and the fall of crude prices in the past couple of years has added insult to injury.
We will keep working until we say, well, we can't anymore, and continue fulfilling the commitments we have with our banks and our suppliers, who are the main business allies we have.
The financial crisis prompted more protests, and the opposition has been calling for early presidential election. But the president blames the country's chaos on an economic war being waged against his government. He's announced the creation of a constitutional assembly, saying a new constitution would neutralize the opposition and defeat coup plotters, paving the way for peace to prevail in Venezuela. However, his opponents believe the move only maximizes the president's powers. They also fear that the Constituent Assembly would further weaken the National Assembly, Venezuela's opposition-controlled legislative body.
What we're seeing in this case is those kinds of internal issues, those contradictions, are being exploited by these external forces, primarily the U.S., in order to target and to engage in regime change.
Whether the embattled leader manages to turn the table or not, one thing is for certain: the South American nation is now deeply divided, and the current political crisis will not help the people who are struggling to make ends meet on a daily basis.
Our guests for this debate are Latin America expert Mr. Javier Farje, who's joining us live from London, and we're also joined by political commentator Mr. Robert Valencia, who is joining us live from New York. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us. Mr. Valencia, I'll start with you. What do you make of the recent escalation in this crisis in Venezuela?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to your show. I think this is the sum of all fears and the sum of all the economic measures that have been initiated by the Chavez regime. And I'm saying Chavez because this is not a problem that happened overnight. This is something that we've seen under Hugo Chavez and a regime called, as we all know it, called the Chavismo, that has been in power for more than 15 years. The fact that Venezuela has been dependent upon oil prices and expecting that oil barrels will hit the three-digit mark is not going to happen, at least not in the near future. Venezuela has been desperately looking for help, especially from countries like Russia, also the economic cartels such as the OPEC, so that they could increase oil prices. And they did not get any bargain. And now we're seeing this economic crisis and socioeconomic crisis deepening in the country. Obviously, this is not something new, and I mentioned the Chavismo regime that has deepened the crisis in Venezuela. But as we just heard on the report, Venezuela has been a country that has been dependent on imports from other countries. It's a country that did not incentivize any kind of competitiveness and self-sufficiency. And unfortunately, what we're seeing today is shortage of food staple, people making long lines even to buy toilet paper or bread. So unfortunately, the situation has become untenable, and now President Maduro wants to stay in power by way of weaponry and importing tear gas against people who are just fed up, basically, with the situation. Unfortunately, the region in Latin America, in this particular case, should not remain strange from the situation, should not isolate itself. Venezuela is suffering from a deep humanitarian crisis, and the countries on the Western Hemisphere need to take action. I'm not saying that a military intervention is necessary, but the fact that people are starving and they don't have the basic needs that they need, the basic needs that they should get, well, that should be a big red flag for all the countries in the region. And this is why the OAS is trying to take actions into their own matters, even though the efforts have been fruitless. Okay. But at least the situation has been monitored in the region.
Okay, so Mr. Farhay, I wanted to ask you then, Mr. Farhay, as Mr. Valencia there mentioned, do you think as well that Chavismo, as we may call it, is partly at least to blame for this, that the country really hasn't prepared for low oil prices and obviously the consequences of that?
First of all, President Chavez was elected. He was not a regime. He was a government. The right wing, the Robert seems to represent pretty well from New York, keep on talking about regime to kick into people's minds. That is not a democratically elected government. Maduro and Chavez were both democratically elected. So it's not a regime, it's a government. Second, it's true there's been a level of incompetence from the part of the government, but the problem was that when President Maduro took office, after the death of President Chavez, he suffered the consequences of the drop, a massive drop of oil prices in the international markets. I would agree with Robert that indeed the high dependency that Venezuela has on oil prices has made things even more difficult. But what you have at the moment is that we're not talking about legitimate protests. We know that many people in Venezuela are protesting peacefully, but most of the violence that has been happening in Venezuela have been in the hand of violent thugs from the opposition who seems to have taken over the protests in Venezuela at the expense of a more moderate elements. If you are a moderate element in the opposition, you are beaten up. In relation to the Constituent Assembly, here we go again with the same scratch record of the Constituent Assembly for President Maduro to stay in power. That is not true. There's 9 objectives, and I've got the objectives here. A month and a half ago, I attended a meeting in Caracas, I was there, with the Presidential Commission of the Constituent Assembly. At no point in this Constituent Assembly there's going to be any issue related to President Maduro staying in power longer than his actual administration, until his current administration finishes. What they're trying to do is introduce certain reforms to consolidate certain groups or certain organizations that were created after the 1999 Constitution. And at the same time, I would like to remind Robert that the Articles 348 and 349 of the Constitution allow the president to call for a constituent assembly. Not only that, the National Assembly could have done that. Municipalities could have done that. 15% of the people who are registered to vote could have done that, and they haven't done it. And the president, according to the very Constitution under which the National Assembly is working, he is entitled to call for this Constituent Assembly to reform and improve the current Constitution. And no time in the 9 objectives which I have here, there's any issues related to President Maduro staying longer in power. And not only that, I would like to remind that in case of violence, we have seen only 2 days ago, a lorry full of food was burned by the opposition. The very things that the people need to feed were burned and destroyed by the opposition. I was in Caracas a month and a half ago, and I saw the consequences of the violence perpetrated by the so-called opposition in Caracas. So yes, the government might have some responsibility in the way it has managed the situation, but at the same time, the majority of Venezuelans do not believe that violence is right.
So let me put some of the points that you just made, Mr. Farhi, because you got through a lot of content there, Mr. Farhi. So let me put some of the points that you just made there, Mr. Farhi, to Mr. Valencia. Mr. Valencia, Mr. Farhi there spoke about the violence that we have seen, and certainly the violence has been quite disturbing, especially that protester who was also set alight. And then, of course, then we had this helicopter which was taken over by this rogue policeman, and he dropped grenades on the Supreme Court. All of that certainly is not a helpful situation, certainly. Where is that all headed then, in that sort of insecure situation?
Well, obviously there's not an easy exit, or there's an easy way out to this crisis, but I want to remind Mr. Farhi of a couple points, and I think this is the argument that a lot of Chavismo sympathizers miss, is that just because a candidate, or just because a president was elected democratically, or the act of democracy itself is just going to be demonstrated on election polls, well, that is a very short-sighted version of democracy. Democracy should not stop just by casting your votes. Democracy is representing all the people that you are going to represent as a president. And democracy should guarantee the basic rights of every Venezuelan in this case. The fact that, they keep hammering on the fact that, yes, Maduro, by the way, who won by a very slim margin, and they're saying, well, this was a democratic process, and as such, it should be respected. Well, then if you win by democratic, look at Syria. Everybody's saying, Bashar al-Assad was elected democratically, even though he has done very poorly and he has even killed his own people. Is that really what we should consider as democracy? I don't think so. When you are a president, you're supposed to champion the well-being of your citizens. Are we seeing that in Venezuela?
I apologize for interrupting you,
not.
Mr. Valencia. If you allow me, Mr. Valencia, to come in here, because, if we talk about the Constituent Assembly, then, the Constituent Assembly, by definition, has the people's participation within it, by definition. So why would that be a bad thing? Wouldn't that then be a good thing within this situation, whether you're pro-Maduro or anti-Maduro?
I understand, but we have to really clear out the way to understand what a democracy is, because unfortunately a lot of viewers think that democracy is just exercise when you go and cast your vote. Democracy is much more than that. Now you're pointing out at the assembly, the National Assembly in Venezuela. They have, even though they have reached the majority of seats in Congress, there is not so much that they can do. That's why Maduro is trying to strike down this law or this legislation, where he can actually exert more power than he already has, becoming a country that is just as authoritarian as many countries in the world. So, and by the way, Maduro has been actually governing the country by way of decrees, which is really not a decree. It's completely different than a bill or a law in the country. So unfortunately, what Maduro is trying to do is, first of all, he's trying to gain time. He doesn't want to call for elections, even though elections are supposed to take place next year. He's trying to push this back to 2019, if I'm not mistaken. So unfortunately, again, the situation has been untenable. The guest has said, I've been to Venezuela, I've been to Caracas a couple of months ago. I'm sure he has seen the long lines, and yes, they keep the government keeps blaming on the opposition, and he keeps blaming it on entrepreneurs and people who own business. But how are you supposed to buy raw materials when you cannot access international markets, because Venezuela has a black market and is having a tight control over U.S. dollar and foreign exchange? They're not going to buy, people are not going to buy stuff in bolívares. They are going to buy stuff at international markets with U.S. dollars. And that's the problem. People in Venezuela don't have access to that money. So unfortunately, there are a lot of reforms that have been taking place, not just on the economic front, but also on the political one.
So Mr. Farhi, Mr. Valencia made a point there, and I'll get you to, of course, respond to all of his points. But the point I wanted to hone in on, if you allow, Mr. Farhi, is, do you think that President Maduro is the president for all Venezuelans? Is he properly representing all Venezuelans, even those who are protesting on the streets?
Well, he was elected by the majority of Venezuelans. The fact that some of them decided to oppose his government by violent means doesn't mean that he's not a democratically elected president. But by the same time, the National Assembly is still in session. if there was a dictatorship, that wouldn't be the case like it happened in 1992 in Peru when President Fujimori closed the Congress and sent everybody packing to their houses. If you watch private television in the morning, and I've seen it, they criticize the government left, right, and center. If there was a dictatorship, that wouldn't be allowed to happen. Many of the people who have been attacking military bases in the US, they would have been imprisoned, sent for life, and yet indictments have not been issued yet. So we are talking about a government that has not done what Roberts is accusing him of doing. Yes, there is shortages. I've seen the cues. Of course I have seen the cues. I'm not denying that there is a crisis, a serious crisis there. But at the same time, we have to see who has the responsibility. First of all, the government from 2013 onward gave the income that the government received from exports of oil in dollars was given. There was a quota given to the private sector to import those produce in which Venezuela is not self-sufficient. What they are trying, and that money completely disappeared. And they have discovered clandestine warehouses with food has been stored by private companies. Second, they have created a community project by which they will try to grow and distribute in local markets, the local markets, the produce in which Venezuela is self-sufficient. But these markets do not operate because the opposition, the violent groups of the opposition, prevent these lorries from moving around the cities, at least in the case of Caracas. And I saw that by myself when I was there a month and a half ago, that the government could have managed the situation before. And better, there's no question about that. And nobody is denying that there is a crisis here. But, you know, we're talking about a democracy. You say that it's not enough to vote. I agree with that. But if it wasn't democratic, why is the National Assembly still sessioning? What did they do a few months ago? There was going to be a project of joint venture between Russian investors and PDVSA, the state-owned oil company, in order to be able to give capital to the oil company. And the National Assembly opposed that. That means that they're actually boycotting the very economic measure that might help Venezuela to start getting out of this crisis.
Okay, so,
and they've done that all along. If you see the records of National Assembly, that's what they've been doing all along since November 2015.
Because we are running out of time, if you allow me, Mr. Farr, Mr. Valencia, I wanted to bring up your mention earlier of the OAS, the Organization of American States, and obviously we saw, I'm sure you saw that very heated exchange between the Venezuelan delegate and pretty much most of the other delegates around that table there. I'm wondering, the Organization of American States, according to Venezuela's government, is a pro-American organization, if I may use that term loosely, obviously. The delegate was saying that the OAS members who were talking about the crisis in Venezuela, about needing to intervene in some fashion to stop the crisis, they were pretty much doing America's bidding. What are your thoughts about that, Mr. Valencia?
Well, I mean, certainly OAS has as a representative, they have U.S. and they have Canada, they have all the countries from the Americas. But honestly, when you look at the attempts at solving this crisis, we're not just talking about OAS. We're also talking about UNASUR, or the Union of South American Nations, which is actually one of the initiatives that started with Hugo Chavez. And we're just talking about South American nations. UNASUR tried to resolve this issue years ago. And unfortunately, when the opposition and the ruling government were sitting down on the table trying to negotiate a peaceful end to this crisis, nothing came to fruition. So regardless of OAS or not, I think that there's no willingness from the government, from the Maduro government, to really solve a crisis. They just want to stay in power for as long as he pleases. So the OAS, what it's trying to do is just to have in unison, let's say, they just want to have a unanimous condemnation of what's happening in that country. Obviously, there's not going to be any economic sanctions because the OAS it's in no position to place any economic sanctions like the UN would do. So this is just more or less like a diplomatic way to say this is enough. We need to find a peaceful or an easy way out of this crisis. And of course, the opposition do not want Maduro in power, even though, and I think the core of this conversation here is, yes, he was elected democratically, but the problem here is when you don't have a president that is not representing Venezuelans, when he clearly said, we're going to solve this problem by way of bullets, and not by way of ballots, then that says a lot. This is a president who is becoming more authoritarian by the minute. This is not the person who wants to represent all Venezuelans. And to the early point of Mr. Farh's point, he's saying, you know, protesters are responding with violence. They're not holding guns. The opposition, the military, or the Guardia Bolivariana, they are the ones holding tear gas. They have been killing a lot of people lately. So please, let's just not do this false equivalence.
Let me just come in here because we only have 2 minutes and I want to give the final word, if you allow me to, Mr. Farhi. Mr. Farhi, I want to give the final word to you and ask you, Mr. Farhi, as well about the role of regional countries, be it through the OAS, be it through UNICEF or any other organization.
The OAS is hopeless and useless, and there's no point in going to the OAS because the clear mandate from the OAS is that to get rid of President Maduro. I think we have to go back to that. By the way, it's the opposition that attack military bases. It's the opposition that attack hospitals. They have the Molotov bombs with feces there. So please, spare me the only people who are the police. Well, what do you want them to do? Do nothing. In relation to the OAS, there was a dialogue where the former Prime Minister of Spain, Rodríguez Zapatero, and the former President of Dominican Republic and Panama were involved. The opposition abandoned the talks in 2015. I think the only way to try to find some kind of solution for this problem is that the opposition and the government sit and discuss the issue. By the way, Robert has not shown any evidence whatsoever in what he says that President Maduro wants to stay longer in power. Not a shred of evidence whatsoever. But anyway, I think the only way to get out of this mess is dialogue, so people can talk and isolate the violent groups and make sure that some kind of compromise is reached to get Venezuela out of the profound crisis that is going through at the moment.
Okay, gentlemen, we'll leave there at that, but of course we do appreciate both of your contributions to this debate. That was Latin America expert Mr. Javier Farhi, who was speaking to us live from London, and we were also joined by political commentator Mr. Robert Valencia, who was speaking to us live from New York. And of course, viewers, we appreciate you joining us as well. Until next time, good night.